Good morning. Now, if it's okay with you, I would love to start our time together by sharing an embarrassing story from my life, if you don't mind. Now, it's actually a common practice for me to start my mornings with a healthy sprinkling of shame. Anyone else? Just me? So, when I was in junior high, I wasn't exactly what you would call a great student. In fact, I think I barely qualified as a student in most teachers' minds that had me. And I can remember getting in trouble one of these times with my teachers named Mrs. Schlomock. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, that is a perfectly generic teacher name. Like, she was destined to become a teacher. But there was one day where, with Mrs. Schlomock, I really crossed the line, and she gave me a detention slip. Now, I'm guessing that there are many here in this room whose souls have never been sullied by getting a detention slip. You sweet, sweet little cherub angels, you, I know. But even for me, who wasn't a great student, I was extremely nervous about what would happen if my mom found out about this. This would be the straw that broke the camel's back. So then, I had a devious idea. I thought, if she never sees the detention slip, then there's not a problem, right? Now, I accept all judgment, but it was at this point that I decided to go mission impossible and try to forge my mom's signature. Now, I have to tell you, okay, my mom has a super easy signature to forge. In fact, I brought a picture of it right here so you can see, so you can take a look for yourself. I mean, what? Look at that. If you ask me, she was practically begging me to forge that for years, okay? I was like a shark to the chum seeing that. I knew, that's so easy. I can do that. So I decided that I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm hard at work in the lab, cranking away. I'm practicing the signature like 30 or 40 times, just keep going and going. And then I finally was like, okay, now's the time. I got to go for it. I'm just going to put the ink to the paper, and I put that signature right there on the detention slip. This was the moment that I knew there was no turning back. So the next day I head to Mrs. Schlomock's class, and the whole time I'm just like muttering bad, positive self-talk to myself, like, you got this, you're cool as a cucumber, no one cooler, all right. I put it down on the desk, take a deep breath, and then instantly, without missing a beat, she says, "Nice try." Now, much like you are probably thinking right now, I'm running through every possible way that she could have figured this out. The only clear answer was telepathy. Like, she must have just read my thoughts, but I'm sure you're curious. So can I share with you guys right now how she figured it out? I know this is like a real 2020 murder mystery right now happening. So, like I said, I had practiced this signature for a long time. I wrote it over and over again. But what I didn't think about was that my practice canvas was the detention slip itself. Yes, that's right. So there were dozens of practice signatures scrawled all over this slip, and I just confidently was like, nailed it. Now, I should remind you that I wasn't like some young child. I was in 7th grade. So what you have here is just a fascinating case study concerning the overconfidence of the adolescent male. But I share all of that for a reason, I promise. I wanted to share that because this was a moment in my life where I was so sure of how I was coming across and projecting. But instead, my motivations ended up being paper thin and painfully obvious to everyone around me. I mean, in this story, my teacher just had to take one look at me, and she saw right through me. She took one look and said, "Hey, I know what you're doing." Have you ever had someone call you out like that? Have you had a moment where you were trying really hard to convince others around you to project a certain image, but it totally fell flat? Now, it probably wasn't about a detention slip, but something where afterwards you thought to yourself, man, are they looking right through me? Well, I want to share that because Jesus similarly saw some paper-thin motives in people. A notable group of people that I want to talk about today were the Pharisees. Jesus had a lot to say about these guys for a variety of reasons. But if you're newer to this church thing and don't know who the Pharisees are, then let me give you a little bit of background. The Pharisees were a Jewish group of religious leaders that were very popular with the masses. In fact, this was a group of people that many considered to be the highest religious authority in their culture. They were super influential, especially in the local synagogues. They knew the scriptures in and out. They were certainly intelligent, but Jesus was blunt in his opinion about their motivations. And if you don't know what he thought about them, well, let's take a look at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23. Starting at verse 2, Jesus says, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you. But don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." Don't miss this part. Everything they do is for show. Wow. Can you imagine the sting of that? Like, try to imagine just for a moment that Jesus is putting you on blast like that. Now, of course, it's not a pleasant thought exercise. But I'm sure some of you in here are asking yourself, well, what was it about these guys that made Jesus so fiery and so passionate? Well, simply put, their posturing and the spirit of what they were doing were in direct opposition to Jesus' gospel. Jesus pretty much took a look at them and said, hey, I know what you're doing. So that's some background, but let's take a look at a specific moment that Jesus took umbrage with. The moment is found in Matthew chapter 6. This is part of the famous Sermon on the Mount. In this passage, Jesus is talking about the practice of fasting. I could give you a lot of details about the logistics of fasting and the purposes of it in these times, but let me just share this simple explanation of what fasting is. It's a humbling of the soul. It's done by giving up desires of the flesh so that we can fully focus on God. And in this case, Jesus is referring to the Pharisees giving up food for their fasts. So let's see what Jesus has to say about these guys fasting in Matthew chapter 6, starting at verse 16. "And when you fast, don't make it obvious, as the hypocrites do. For they try to look miserable and disheveled so that people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth, that is the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair and wash your face. Then no one will notice that you're fasting, except your Father, who knows what you do in private. And your Father, who sees everything, will reward you." So all of this is super interesting to me, but I truly don't believe that Jesus was two-dimensionally giving us instructions and feedback on fasting alone. Don't get me wrong, he's definitely sharing about that. But there's so much more to this passage that is relevant to us today. Jesus points out the very obvious motives of the Pharisees. What did they want? They wanted the praise and the applause. Well, they got it, and then some. They got some very specific attention from Jesus. But again, don't get confused about what Jesus is saying here. Jesus isn't condemning the act of fasting here. He's condemning the motives of these men. Think about it this way. Have you ever had someone say to you, listen, it's not what you said, but how you said it? Well, in this case, Jesus is saying, it's not what the Pharisees did, but it's how they did it. Fasting was not the problem, but boasting about it was the problem. It's because the why matters. In fact, Jesus is letting us know a simple truth that I want us to all think about today. Why we do the right thing matters more than actually doing the right thing. These guys, they were perfecting the art of the humble brag. Now, even if you don't know what that term means, you're like, what's a humble brag? You likely know it when you see it. It's false modesty. It's a kind of fake, self-deprecating comment that's actually meant to draw attention to something you're actually proud of. Now, I'm just going to say it, okay? I have young kids. I talk with parents a lot. I think parents may be the actual worst about humble brags. Now, other parents, certainly not me. Totally not me, just other parents. But think about your social media feeds for a moment. I know that every one of us have totally seen posts that make our eyes roll into the back of our head where we're like, I'm so sure. In fact, to help us understand this a little bit better, I brought some humble brag examples to read straight from the old interweb, okay? So here's the first one. I can't believe I got all the way to work without realizing I was wearing my daughter's jeans. My coworkers now refer to me as that crazy lady who can fit into her teenager's jeans. Oh, how embarrassing. I thought that might strike a particular nerve right before all of our 4th of July barbecues. Here's another one. It says, I'm so tired of people seeing the crafts I make with my kids and saying, I need to start selling them on Etsy. Especially since I barely put any effort into making them, you guys. They're just fun. Sure thing, Susan. They're Bush League at best, and we all know it, okay? Okay, here's one more. Uh-oh. I don't know how that got there. So apparently this is from me. This is very real. I'm just going to be honest with you. It says, I didn't expect to get even close to my record on the Peloton today, but I'll take it. Oh man, that's a little embarrassing. Now again, just to be fully transparent with you here, as I'm preparing for this message, I had to think to myself, have I ever seen any good examples of a humble brag? And unfortunately, I was like, I've definitely seen some good examples from myself. So these Pharisees, they're perfecting the art of the humble brag. They're pretty much going up to the ladies at the temple and saying, hey, I'd love to have a drink with you, but shucksy doodles, I can't. Yeah, I'm fasting. It's tough, but someone's got to do it, right? Well, not just anyone, but important people. You get it, right? So let me pause here for a moment, okay? It's at this point that it's a little easy for us to look at these guys, look at this passage, and maybe, just maybe, start to feel a little self-righteous. I mean, right? How many of us right now read that passage and we're like, get a load of these guys. Can you believe those jerks? But if that's what we take away from Jesus' words, then we've dangerously missed the point. This passage was not Jesus giving us a green light to go out and police everyone else's behavior. No, the people who openly chuck spears or gossip about those that they suspect to be violating this principle are themselves often violating it. Don't forget last week's takeaway. Don't look at the speck of dust in your neighbor's eyes, but remove the larger piece of debris from your own. So actually, this passage is an invitation to look in the mirror right back at ourselves. Maybe right now, that's not what you want to hear this morning, but it's true. So let's do just that. Let's talk about us for a moment. I'm sure none of us wants to say, I kind of get the Pharisees here. It's a little uncomfy, as the kids say. But if I'm being kind of vulnerable for a moment, don't we kind of understand where they're coming from? I mean, they have these awesome things that they're doing for the kingdom, these spiritual things. They're just trying to set an example, right? Let's be real by saying that there are plenty of times that we can struggle with this, even if it's for the best reasons. Think back to a moment where you're doing something awesome for the kingdom, something awesome for your church, something awesome for someone else in need, and it feels great to be making a difference. I mean, it does. But then maybe, just maybe, there's a moment where we kind of want others to know about it. If we're being honest, now just saying it right now, it's tough because that's the kind of thing that you think but definitely don't say out loud, right? but you want others to know, right, that you worked hard to do something good, or that even when you were going through your own storm in life, you were still thinking about someone else. I don't say any of this to shame anyone. I'm just as guilty. But I share all this for us to get to this question of why. Are the Pharisees just evil guys and wanted to do all this just because they were evil? I don't think so. So the question is why? Why do we do that? Why do we insist on tooting our own horn or drawing attention to ourselves? It'd be extremely easy to say, well, it's because we're prideful people, right? But is that really the answer? Or could it be the opposite? Is there a chance that we're so insecure, or we're so lonely, or we're going through such a difficult time that we're looking for that validation in the form of a viral post or a pat on the back? Carrie Nieuwhof, who's an influential Christian leader, says this: bragging is our insecurity leaking out. I had to read this one a few times because, man, that just cuts to the core, doesn't it? Well, why does it? It's because this issue of self-worth is one of the most basic issues an individual wrestles with. But it's also among the most important issues that we wrestle with. Just think about yourself for a moment. Who you see in the mirror, how much you value or devalue that person, informs and affects nearly every thought, conversation, and relationship that you have. The Pharisees didn't have social media. But I really do think that social media has some interesting connective tissue to this admonishment that Jesus shared. I mean, think about it. Social media allows us to do something that we can't in real life. We get to edit, we get to delete, we get to self-promote this manufactured image of ourselves, and perhaps all the while losing our grasp on the true image of who we are in Christ. Most of us in here have some form of social media, some account that we use, that we have connections on. Some of you track the number of friends you have, followers, maybe likes or views. Maybe some of us check those things more than the others around us, but all of us likely have a lot of people looking into our digital life who would say that at least to some degree, they're connected to you. This is something that's kind of new in our culture and has only been around for the last 12 to 15 years. That sounds like a lot, but that's really not that long. And I don't even have to go into some deep dive for us to know that social media has a tendency to cause a lot of problems. One of the things I've definitely read about in studies is that the more and more selfie-focused we become, the lonelier we can feel. The Pharisees seemed like masters of self-promotion. I kind of think they'd fit right in the age of social media. And again, I don't say this to shame anyone because I'm as guilty as anyone. In a world that wants us to focus only on ourselves, boy, is it tough to resist advertising our righteousness or finding creative ways to brag. And again, I don't think that we're often acting in this manner because we're beaming with confidence and we think that we're the best. I think it's actually usually because we're struggling with insecurity or a lack of self-worth, or we're going through a really emotional time in our lives. Maybe some of us is that we're simply trying to make a connection with others, or even we have this false truth that it's our way to earn God's love. It's difficult to not feel like we've all dipped our toes in this water. In general, we all want to be seen as good enough, even in the kingdom of God and amongst our brothers and sisters in Christ. But all of us, myself included, we need to be aware of the motives behind our words, posts, and actions. It's a great thing when we can pause for a moment and we allow our righteous actions to be a kind of secret intimacy between us and God. When we allow our righteous actions to be a kind of secret intimacy between us and God. That passage said it earlier. He will see what you've done in secret, but rewards you openly. The problem is that we worry more about what others think of us instead of God. The passage that strikes me is shared earlier in the same sermon from Jesus is found in Matthew chapter 6, Starting at verse 3, it says this. Jesus says, "But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and the Father who sees everything will reward you." So, Jesus says that your left hand shouldn't know what your right hand is doing. Now, I have to acknowledge the specific call to the right hand being the one that's doing the good deed. I think this is the first instance of shade being thrown to lefties in the Bible. Jesus is like, hey guys, don't let your lazy, weird left hand know how awesome your right hand is. It's doing great. But the simple message here is that if you are acting on God's behalf, you don't need to let others know about it. You can simply do that. Throughout this sermon, Jesus is arming his disciples and us to be on guard against the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Think about it. You don't give a warning like that unless you think that there's a real threat or concern. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I don't explain the dangers of cryptocurrency to her because there's no point. She's not exposed to that. But what does Jesus know about each and every one of us here? He knows that we're all susceptible to these kinds of heart sins. And that we must do better than the scribes and Pharisees if we're going to push the gospel message forward. He wants us to be doing what we do from an inward desire to please God and not for the applause of men. A nagging question that you might have is, well, then where's the line between let your light shine before men and only to your Father? That's a fair and valid question. In fact, if you're asking that question right now, I'm just going to say that you're likely on the right track. And trust me, it'd be nice if I could just wrap a bow on this and say, all right, here's the line, don't cross it, X, Y, Z, that's the recipe, you're good. But ultimately, the answer is found by looking at the contents of our hearts. Jesus talked about this earlier in the same sermon in Matthew chapter 5. He talked about a wide array of topics: murder, adultery, loving your enemies, so many difficult things. Has anyone caught on that this Jesus guy wasn't too bashful? But when he talked about those difficult things, he didn't say, hey, just don't do those and you're all good. No, if you recall in those passages, he said, don't even think about these things. It's a matter of where our heart is. It's an internal line and not an external line. So we all need to ask ourselves a very simple question before we act, speak, or post. What is my motivation for doing this? Because why we do the right thing matters more than actually doing the right thing. I understand that this feels a little nuanced, pretty abstract. So if I may, let's get a little practical for a moment. I've gone ahead and taken a stab at a heart check for the next time you're tempted in this way. So here are my 3 totally unofficial questions that you can ask yourself the next time before you might post, speak, or do something. Here's the first question you can ask yourself. Does this honor God or myself? Whose glory is it? His or mine? Is this a situation where your left hand definitely knows what your right hand is doing? Is this a classic humble brag? Only you know the answer to that question. Another question you can ask yourself is, what's my emotional state? When there's a lot going on in our lives, our emotions can totally come out sideways, right? If we can all agree on that, and we've all seen it in others, then we definitely know it can be true for us too. So a question you can ask yourself is, are you in an emotional state? Maybe one where it might make you feel better to get a compliment or a pat on the back for what you're doing. Or maybe you're just really hoping that a certain someone is seeing you thrive. Or you're just trying to make connections with people. What's your emotional state? A third question that you can ask yourself is, do I need to share this? This is a critical question. Do you need to share what you're going through or a selfless act that you're doing? Well, to answer that, I would point back to our original passage. Jesus said that these Pharisees, they put on long faces so that everyone would notice and would see what they were doing. But what did he say to his followers? What did he say to us? He said, hey, go about your routines in a way that no one would notice. Why? So they wouldn't be drawing praise to themselves. So, do you need to share it? Well, it might depend if you're looking for the applause of men or not. In light of all this, I couldn't help but recall a really powerful story about a guy named Chadwick Boseman. You likely recognize his name. Among many great acting roles, he was the Black Panther in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This was a role that was groundbreaking for a ton of reasons, but it made him a hero in real life to so many kids. Chadwick was notorious for doing many hospital visits and granting wishes to appear as the Black Panther to sick and dying kids. Now, right off the top, it's a super heartwarming story, but it becomes something even greater when you know the end of the story. If you don't know, Chadwick Boseman passed away at a very early age due to colon cancer. It was a sudden shock to the world because he kept his diagnosis a secret. Why? Because he didn't want the focus to be on him. You could even say that he didn't want to put on a long face in his suffering. In the midst of it, there's this touching story where he went out of his way to make a sick kid's dream come true. The story was shared after Chadwick's death by a guy named Nate Moore, who's a Marvel Studios executive, and he shared about his final interaction with the actor. He said that one of his last acts on earth in his dying days was doing work for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It was during the heart of the COVID lockdown in 2020, and there was a kid out there that his dying wish was, I want to see the Black Panther, I want to talk with him. And they worked together to get this child a special voice message from the Black Panther, T'Challa. On top of that, this child was sent a package of toys, autographed memorabilia. And none of this was an easy feat because they weren't even allowed to leave their homes at this point in the pandemic. And also, Chadwick was in such a weakened physical state, but he figured out how to make it work because he cared so much about this kid. Nate Moore shared the final text message he received from Chadwick about this boy's wish. Chadwick texted him and said, "It broke me, man, but we need to do that for them. People deserve abundant life, special moments. They've been through hell battling disease. If we were able to ease their suffering and bring joy for a moment, then we made a difference in his life." This is a powerful story. It's a great example, and what I love about it is Chadwick was suffering himself, but he didn't care for anyone to know about it. He just cared about doing the right thing for this kid. It certainly makes me want to do better. Ultimately, if you're looking to take a first step towards being the right kind of selfless, then it's worth realizing that most of these issues that we're talking about here today stem from our self-worth, our insecurity. The person who doesn't think they have value in this world is going to go on a search for it, and that is a tiring search. It's the reason why we would look to the approval of men and why we would fish for the applause. But listen here, God created beauty in you, and that's all he sees when he looks at you. He loves you. He just does. There's nothing that you can do to change that. So you, me, all of us, we have the choice to let that love shape us, our thoughts, our words, and our relationships. Accepting that love is what will help us truly in discerning and being in the right place to figure out doing the right kind of good for the glory of God, and also understanding the grace of allowing our selfless actions to live in secret intimacy between us and God. So today, you might just need to take a step towards accepting that love to be in that place.